Right. Now, Professor Paul Behrens is the British Academy Global Professor at the University of Oxford. His research and writing on climate, energy, and food has appeared in scientific journals and media outlets worldwide. He's an editor and author of interdisciplinary textbooks, Food and Sustainability, and he has a popular science book, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science, describing humanity's current trajectory and possible futures in paired chapters of pessimism and hope. I'm hoping that Elaine will put those links into the chat as well. Most recently, Paul won the international champion in the Frontiers Planet Prize in 2023. I'm really excited for Paul's talk today on rapid food transformations in a rapidly changing world. Please, can you put your virtual hands together to welcome Paul to give February's 2025's Food Thinkers. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you so much, Christian. That's such a lovely introduction, and I have been enjoying the Food Thinkers series very much. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to talk to you. So what I want to do today is to set out the scene for where we're going with climate impacts and for the development of the food system. I want to start off with talking about how we have systemically underestimated the impacts of climate on different systems around the world. And I think the best way to show this is the so-called burning embers plots from the IPCC reports, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. And what we've done here is we've taken each of the reports through time and shown the risks at different temperatures for different sorts of impacts. So on the left here, we have the aggregate impacts, and these are impacts on the environment and ecology. And on the right, we've got these large-scale discontinuities, these sort of tipping points, these big systems that are changing. And what I want to emphasize here is that the level at which we thought these impacts would be happening has been coming down in temperature through the years. And so what we thought would be happening above 3 degrees in 2001 is now below 2 degrees in 2022. And that's for the broad economic, ecological impacts. It's even more stark for the large-scale discontinuities, for these tipping points that I mentioned, these big reductions. And, especially important for Northern Europe is this ocean conveyor, this heat conveyor called the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And this has potential for really big impacts on the food system. I'm not going to talk too much about that today because I think there's already an awful lot to talk about. But the potential for these tipping points happening at lower temperatures is definitely there now. Now, if we move to the case of the UK, I did some work last year on looking at the climate change impacts on cost of living, which of course is really important for food systems. And what it did was to look at the percentage of all the known risks in the UK climate change risk assessment that was done in 2012 and then 2021. And what we see is similar to this impact that we've seen globally, in that there's been this systemic underestimation of the risks. So we've had a dramatic increase in very high risks. Now, very high in the climate change risk assessment means damages of above £1 billion per year by 2050 under a sort of 2 degrees, which is basically where we're going. And you can see this very, very big impact, this very, very big increase in the risk level there. Another, I think, really quite stunning outcome from the third UK risk assessment, climate change risk assessment, was the statement that in 2021, that the better representation of the landscape and urban areas in the kilometre scale model, this is the big sort of climate model that is then downscaled to the UK, highlighted that there's a very small chance, less than 0.02% of exceeding 40 degrees by 2040. And of course, then a year later, we breached that in both rural and also in urban areas. This obviously becomes sort of really important from a food systems perspective, because then you're thinking about what are the consequences here. One such consequences is heat stress for livestock. There's also crop impacts in terms of the number of days exceeding critical thresholds. And so this is what we've got to start sort of dealing with, is that there's been this ongoing underestimation over time. Globally, there's more work going on in this, and the teams that are looking at this, if you look at the sort of the broad sort of statistical modeling, you see declines in many crops and some increases maybe in some other crops, depending on where they are, temperate latitudes, and what kind of crops they are, such as wheat. In general, though, a lot of those big models, they don't necessarily take into account the full spectrum of extreme weather events or the potential for cascading issues with infrastructure that is impacted by climate change. One study, which I think is really important, and other studies have come to a similar conclusion, looked at the chance of multi-breadbasket reductions in yield, so multi-breadbasket failures. So this is where you've got multiple areas which are producing a specific crop getting hit by multiple extreme weather events in a year, which depress yields by 10%. It varies on the definition paper by paper, but basically a 10% reduction in yields globally. One paper found that the chances before climate change, we've always had this, for maize would be once every 16 years. So once every 16 years, you'd have an event like this around the world, or sort of multiple events like this around the world that would depress yields. At 1.5 degrees, this reduces to once every 3 years, and at 2 degrees, once every 2 years. Other crops like soy, they're not as extreme, they're not as sensitive as maize. I mean, that comes out in all the modeling. But the big jump in this increase is between sort of the Holocene last century and 1.5 degrees. And there's that big jump. And then again, I'm thinking, it's actually going to be this period as we sort of settle in at 1.5 and then shoot above it, that we're going to have these impacts on agricultural systems internationally. Note, I'm going to come back to this. Obviously, a key part of rapid transitions, and actually what I'm going to be focusing a lot on today, is the dietary changes. So in Europe, about 60% of crops are used actually to feed animals. So rough estimates suggest that an estimated third of the UK food price inflation in 2023 was from climate alone. So yes, we had Ukraine, we had other supply chain issues, but this constant grind of climate pushing up the price of food. One study suggested that persistent annual food and climate-flation, as I was saying there, is between 0.9 and 3% per year by 2035. And so this is an ongoing pressure on society. And the way that I'm sort of seeing this is in this schematic here. Over time, you're going to have these increases in cost of living. So in the blue here, cost of living has always gone up and down depending on geopolitical issues, other weather issues, all sorts of different factors, supply chain factors. As climate change hits, it adds on this extra stress, this persistent climate inflation on the food system. And as we go in through time, we know that this is incredibly destabilizing for societies. We saw in 2023 and earlier strikes, for example, based on pay and the cost of living. So this is very destabilizing as a process. If we go further up, you see food riots in a lot of the times in middle-income nations and lower-income nations. You start to see, when you do see food prices spike, you see riots, you see political instability. So this is what we're really going to have to avoid. And I think one of the main messages of today is things will be changing quite fast. There are things that we can do about it, and we need to embrace that change and actually act for the better here. A lot of you study food systems, and so this is really just a little bit of a recap, but the full breadth of food system impacts is really quite overwhelming. I mean, if we look across all the planetary boundaries, and these are these sort of large environmental crises that we face, we see that food systems are the second biggest driver of climate change, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, the biggest driver of land system change, the biggest user of fresh water, the biggest driver of nutrients, which drive marine death and aquatic problems, the second largest driver of ocean acidification, the second largest driver of aerosol loading. This is an interesting one because as we continue to decarbonize the energy system, agriculture will eventually take over that first position there as well. And obviously for high novel entities, microplastics, it's high as well. And on top of this, number one for zoonotic diseases, it's hard to do that modeling, but very likely. Same thing for antimicrobial resistance. And the majority of this across this whole spectrum of issues is animal agriculture, within the agricultural system. And so really, there's no way we are going to really get to a sustainable future without addressing the food system and specifically animal agriculture within it. So the Great Food Transformation, as many people on the call already know and well understand, made of three pillars: dietary change, reductions in food waste, and improvements in production. So this is what the food system has to change towards. But these are not created equal. And this is work from the University of Oxford that looked at the different interventions that we can make and compared them to one another. And now this is global, okay? So this is not just for high-income nations, but we have the total emissions to 2100 there on the left, and then the different interventions across on the x-axis. And you can see that plant-rich diets is the best option that we have, the biggest option. Now, even if we address the entire energy system, the food system and alone is enough to push us beyond 1.5 and perhaps even 2-degree limits. And this is even larger in high-income nations. So if I was to show this picture for the UK, it would be even greater, the opportunity for plant-rich diets. So the next thing I really want to drive home today is that one way or another, we're likely to go plant-based. I think we will actually have to go plant-based one way or another, because prices are going to go up. Adaptation costs, where you have to adapt to climate impacts, are essentially defensive expenditures. This is a quote from a sort of a way of talking about things from Herman Daly. And defensive expenditures are really just a drag on society. So you have to redirect expenditures elsewhere to allow for the adaptation costs, which allow agriculture to keep running. And the reason plant-based, we're going to have to go plant-based one way or another, is because the plant to meat conversion ratios, basically the thermodynamics of the system, are dictating that. So calories, if you look at the calorie conversion, we're talking about 1 to 11% of the calories in plants going through the animal, and then we're eating at the end. Protein, only 4 to 20% gets converted. And you only need about 3 to 15% of the land needed for the equivalent plant protein as the animal protein, for example. So really, we can't afford the system today. Even if we could ignore the emissions and the environmental impacts, we can't really afford the system today because there's not enough slack, there's not enough headroom or resilience in the system to allow for the climate impacts that we'll be receiving. This is a really interesting paper that came out recently that looked at the energy return on the energy investment across the world for agricultural products. And what you can see here is that over to the right, you've got the animal products, you've got the meat, the dairy, and you can see that the energy return is just so much lower. And so this is a point again about thermodynamic inefficiencies. I mean, this is a very physics way to sort of think about things, but the size of the system has to be so much larger because it's so inefficient. So if we actually shift in advance, we can avoid this damage and harness the many benefits of actually adopting these diets. And there's many different sort of additional benefits, as many on the call will know. Around 75% of agricultural land is used for livestock, and that's around 35 to 40% of total habitable land. And so if the UK, for example, ate a plant-rich diet, we'd save an area almost the size of Scotland. And we've got this here for some work that we did. You can see on the x-axis, you've got the 2020 baseline of what people are eating, and then you've got different types of diets. As we move to the right, we've got more and more plants in that diet. And you can see how the embodied land use, and this is just within the UK, this is not taking into account imports. So just within the UK, you'd save an area roughly the size of Scotland moving towards that reference diet. And then you'd save more than the size of Wales. It's always the size of Wales, unfortunately, it comes in everywhere, but more than the size of Wales when moving towards a totally plant-based diet. And this is based on the fact that the Lancet diet has ranges in it. So taking the different ranges. And this is largely this shift from these animal products to things like legumes. So you can see how the legumes expand, but the expansion is just so much less because, again, you just need much less land, that 3 to 15% of the land that you need in order to provide that food. So you can imagine what that means. In one work that we did, what we looked at, if high-income nations alone moved to a plant-based diet, how much land upstream would be saved, And if you could save it, and if you returned it to potential natural vegetation, how much carbon could you sequester on that land? And we found that you would save an area roughly the size of the EU. And then if you were to be able to return that to the potential natural vegetation, you'd save around 14 years of global agricultural emissions. So a really big opportunity. It's just that's just on the carbon, on the emissions part of the picture. The other important part of these shifts is that it buys us time. If we have a look at reducing livestock, you reduce the methane flux that's going into the atmosphere, and you can actively reduce temperatures over some period. We did some work where we asked over 200 experts around the world what global livestock reductions would be needed to meet the Paris Agreement to get to 1.5. And these were the different sort of trajectories that we found, or at least the experts identified. And so these are quite significant reductions of about 60% by 2036 in order to get onto this target. When you put this through a climate model, we had a look at what these reductions mean. And this means avoided warming of around 0.42 degrees by 2100 and 0.17 degrees by 2050. And when you look at the sort of the impacts that we saw on the food system, that's a significant saving if you're able to shift all of that warming down. You also have these benefits for biodiversity. When you look upstream, you can do a similar thing as we did for the carbon sequestration, the carbon opportunity cost on that land. You can also look at the biodiversity opportunities. And this is a picture here where we look at the relationship between biodiversity loss and carbon loss around the world. And you can see many areas have both high carbon and biodiversity loss due to consumption around the world. And so in that brown there, you can see where both of them co-locate. And again, you can do a similar sort of thing in the modeling that we do, where you look at the global impacts of different products. And many of you have seen this several times before, except maybe that biodiversity part. And you can see that biodiversity part there in the third sort of vertical column there. And you can see how different products contribute to that biodiversity loss. The other big picture of this, in terms of the opportunities, is that if you save that land, you also have climate resilience. One study found that afforestation reduces the number and intensity of cyclones everywhere over Europe compared to experiments with smaller forest cover. Typically what this means is you basically rough up the surface, so you get more and more vegetation, and by having more and more vegetation, you're able to reduce the storm surges, so you're able to reduce the peak winds, and that can actually reduce the damage that you get from climate change. Similar things with flooding. If you're able to return a lot of regions to potential natural vegetation, it will have a greater absorptive capacity. And you can see another paper here that this is difficult to do modeling wise, but they looked across a number of different papers, a number of different examples, and looked at which types of rewilding attenuate in which different regions. And they found that rewilding basically attenuates, reduces these flooding impacts generally across the board. If you look at the sort of measured outcomes where they've looked at in terms of the real world and the modeled outcomes. The other benefit here is the geopolitical resilience that you get from it. One study that we looked at the dietary shifts here is we said, well, okay, we've had this invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and we know that these are two major bread baskets. So what if we have this shift in the EU towards these diets? What kind of resilience does this imply? And then we found in general, the figure that you can see in front of you, you're going to reduce a lot of the crops that you need. And you're going to be able to make up for the amount of crops that are exported by Ukraine and Russia. So pretty much across the board, you're able to make up for the exported crops from Ukraine and Russia through this shift. And you can see that there's a lot of detail in some of these figures, so you can have a look at these publications later. So there's been a lot of focus on demand. How do you get there? How do you get towards this future where you are able to shift to these plant-based diets, which are better for the environment, which are better for the health, for animal welfare? And there's been a lot of focus on demand. This is one of my favorites, is the World Resources Institute had a big assessment of the different interventions that food service providers could use for promoting sustainable food choices. And they went through lots of different options here. And then they looked at what had the most bang for the buck and what was the consensus across the literature. It's a really great study if you want to download it and have a look through. But then there comes the question, what about supply? And this comes down to the fraught areas of production and farming. We've been looking at this quite a bit recently and looking at what this means for the economic implications. Obviously, this is a really big area at the moment with farmers having a really hard time of it, of course, and also the protests that we've seen across London. In a very simplistic view, how you analyze this is, you look at your income from your subsidies, your income from your production, and your assets on the farm. These are the sort of various streams that you need to take into account. And then the net impact of these three factors dictate this sort of financial gap that you need to address some way in a just transition and give people options about. There are obviously all of the heritage and tradition arguments as well, just bracketing that off for the moment, just looking at the economic implications. So last year we had a look at how subsidies flow through the system. And what you can start to do is look at, well, how do those subsidies shift under different assumptions of different diets? So last year we had a look at the common agricultural policy across the EU and found that over 80% of the subsidies are going towards animal-based products. And that's hardly surprising given that the subsidies are for direct payments on land and animal agriculture takes up more land, and so it's related to that. So you can look at the subsidy intensity for the different products. But one thing I really want to highlight here is if we go down these paths, we're not only going to have to think about the livestock subsidies and the animal agricultural sector, but also the upstream feed sectors as well, because that actually contributes quite a large amount as well to the entire animal agricultural system. Then we can have a look at the income from the production and how that might change with different diets. So what we have here is the embodied cap subsidy. And this is in sort of 2020 when the UK was broadly sort of under the same system. Obviously, there's this divergence now. And so we'll be investigating that. This is currently looking at the original sort of EU cap system. And again, you can see the diet that you saw before, which is the 2020 baseline, and then these other diets, some with a bit of meat, some with no meat, some with a bit more meat. And you can see the reduction in the subsidy there. You can also then look at the labor input required. Now, this is not to say that, these subsidies go away, these farmers go away. This is not what we're saying here. What we're looking at is what the implications are, and then you can have a look at the pool of resources, the pool of labor, the map, how that looks across different countries, and then try to figure out just just transition pathways for people. The final one here, which I think is an important one to bear in mind, is this is the net farm income, which excludes the cap. So we can see how some sectors are losing money from the products that they produce across, and how that would change with different diets. But the final thing we have to bear in mind is actually farmers have plenty of assets on their farms. And so how do you then sort of think about those assets? If we have this transition and if we move this in this direction, some of those assets will have to be depreciated. So recently we've been looking at the farm assets as well. Here again, you can see the fixed assets for different products, and you can see how they're sort of generally larger for the animal products and how a fair bit of that is down to the feed. So again, it's arable farming assets. This is the asset intensity per kilogram of product as well. You can see the same picture. And again, showing you the same thing that we saw before in the same sort of format here. You can see how those fixed assets would change with different diets, and then what the potentially stranded assets would be if you move towards this system, this diet, and you also then strand those assets. The thing is, though, that assets get depreciated over time. So actually, what we found in this work is that as long as you coordinated about this, as long as you give farmers options and you allow farmers the option to transition in an orderly manner, you don't actually strand too many assets. Well, no assets, depending on the speed at which you go through this transition. So I think, we've got to think about the options here, because this is very analogous to the energy transition. For those of you that don't know, when we move to electricity, we massively improve the efficiency of the system. So if you look at an electric car compared to a petrol vehicle, you're improving the efficiency of the system from something like only 16, 20% for a petrol vehicle up to about 80% for an electric vehicle. It's a similar sort of jump for heat pumps. And when you look around every technology, it gets better and better. In this system, you're producing a similar sort of outcome in the sense that you've got fulfilling the diets of everyone. Arguably, depending on which diet you choose, it would be healthier for the public as well. But you're talking about 35% lower labor inputs, 50% lower land inputs, 70% lower subsidy inputs, 75% lower asset intensities. And then you can start to think, well, how would we want to employ this? Like okay, this sounds fairly technocratic, but how would you want to give people and farmers and producers different opportunities to allow for resilience in the system, these climate impacts that I was talking about earlier? So it allows you to have this absorption of these climate yield losses. I mean, we saw the second worst year in harvests since the early 80s last year. And if yields are going to reduce, we're going to need this headroom. We're going to need this ability to absorb these limits. And this is what this plant-based shift does, is it allows you to better cope with these changes. It also allows you to move to lower yield systems, limited mixed systems with low stocking density, for example, for inter and multi-cropping, for greater food diversity and greater risk-taking for farmers as well in terms of what they're growing, because you could imagine exploring a whole wealth of different foods. I mean, we eat just a handful of crops, of course, and there's many, many, many crops out there for culinary people to explore and farmers to grow. We can also look into things like perennials, which typically have a lower yield. So, for example, wheatgrass there is about 30% that of wheat, for example. So it gives you these options. It gives you these opportunities. It frees up this space economically, labor, and cognitively even to explore these different options. It also gives some more options for the public and resilience. If you do return some of this land to potential natural vegetation, so in the recent land use framework, for example, 9% potentially being taken out of agricultural production, then this means significant things for tourism, for recreation, for green space access. We know that the UK has one of the worst records for mental health across high-income regions. We also know that access to nature is a really important way for people to improve their mental health. And so you can get this sort of virtuous cycle here. You can get significant wilderness spaces. The UK is one of the most nature-deprived countries in the world. And so it just gives these options. Just returning very quickly to demand, I do want to highlight this thing about how much do people want change. And I think, a lot of the studies around the world now are showing that we underestimate how much support there is for change in the world. One study in the US, which is really quite remarkable, asked people, how much do you think other people support, say, a carbon tax or 100% renewable energy by 2035? And across the board, the people underestimated how much actual support there was. This has been shown in the Climate Assembly, of course, and it's been shown in a number of other assemblies around the world, which have also included the acceptance for some reductions in meat, for example. This is at the UK level, and again, you can see this policy support, thanks to Lorraine Whitmarsh for this slide, which shows the support across different interventions. And you can see again that for increasing vegan and veggie options, it's higher than you might think. And so I think we've got to, it's called pluralistic ignorance. And I think we have to, balance our understanding of the world that we see through social media and platforms that shall not be named, and also the actual opinions out there. But if all of this is going in a reasonably good direction from an environmental, from a health, from a animal welfare perspective, unfortunately, we do have the same story in this sector as we've seen over time. So we've seen this general pushback against any shifts in some of these significant social changes over time. We've seen it with smoking. We've seen it for climate change, of course. We've seen it for fossil fuels with ExxonMobil touting algae and touting all these solutions, which there's no real serious engagement with, no serious attempt to develop. And more recently, we've seen big meat and dairy getting in on the action here. And this is a really important, excellent report that I think everybody should go out and read by the Changing Markets Foundation, which is fairly exhaustive in its scope. It's really long. You can read the executive summary. But if you're anything like me, you'll just dive straight into all the detail through it because it's astonishing. The different ways and the different organizations. And we're seeing the same things again: discredit the science, disseminate false information, spread confusion, promote doubt. And it's the same arguments and tactics that we're seeing. We're seeing economic fears, we're seeing scientific interference, false and limited solutions. We're seeing green and health washing. Interestingly, we're also seeing an industry convergence in this case between energy and food systems. So in this case, things like biogas, where the two industries are getting together to promote solutions which in some marginal cases be beneficial, but on the whole, in terms of land use, can be incredibly damaging. We're seeing information campaigns coming out all the time, promoting and holding up existing dietary patterns. I think one of the most interesting recent sort of developments that we've seen coming from, and this is highlighted from the New Merchants of Doubt report, is that we're actually seeing the focus now shifting to young people. And one example that they give is the Undeniably Dairy campaign, which had hundreds of millions of impressions. And Edelman, which is the same PR company that actually worked with Big Oil, they, in one of their documents, are saying how among their audience, they managed to decrease the purchase intent for dairy alternatives by 6%. So they're talking about specifically not just promoting a product, but actually trying to reduce the demand for transition products, as it were. So, at the same time, we've got smaller struggling farmers and lower income in the lower income brackets getting caught in the crossfire of this system that's not providing, but being told misinformation. I'm not going to cover this too much, but we've been having various sorts of other issues with FAO reports and also something called the Dublin Declaration, which is very sort of analogous to the letters that came out talking about the consensus or not of climate change. So trying again to defend the livestock industry. Don't really have time to go into it now. Perhaps we can talk about it a little bit later. The final slide I wanted to just touch upon was, I think, as well as misunderstanding one another publicly, I think we may underestimate scientists' attitude to engagement as well, and willingness to get involved in some of these issues about misinformation. This is a study out from a friend of mine, and he spoke to over, I think it was 9,000 different scientists across Europe. And he asked people whether they thought that scientists and academics should engage in more advocacy or not, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And you can see here that on the whole, people thought that scientists and academics should engage in more advocacy. They also thought that engaging in advocacy wouldn't diminish scientists' credibility. So the big area here is the strongly disagree and disagreement. Some people were neutral, some people thought it did reduce credibility, but only a minority. Interestingly, and this is one of the big takeaways for you guys today, I think, is the assessment of whether people should engage in climate advocacy or not as scientists, and whether they would be willing to do that is quite surprising. So we see that 29% of people already do engage in climate change advocacy, but 58% of scientists would be willing to. And to me, that offers a really big scope, a really big possibility for scientists to be involved, to correct the record, to get the record straight where they see scientific information being misused. And so if you're working in an NGO or if you're a scientist yourself, take heart in some of these results here. even to the extent of participating in legal climate change related protests. There was quite a lot of support and willingness to do that as well. So I think just to finish off today, I think, the way I think about this is we're moving to a very scary future, really, and a lot of pressure on the food system. The pressures, if we try and maintain the system, the expenses that we're going to need to maintain that system are just going to rise and rise and rise. And so we need to sort of work with nature. We need to reassess how we are eating and interacting with the food system in order to harness these opportunities. Because if we're able to do these things, they will be good for us anyway. And so often I do focus on the opportunities for more diverse food. At the moment, we have very, very limited foods that we eat. And the opportunities for landscapes, not only for the consumers, not only for the public, the citizens that eat food, but also for the producers. Because at the moment, producers as well are in a very difficult situation in a system that isn't working out very well for many people in that system. So if you can still keep focusing on these opportunities and map these opportunities, and also give the options there for people to engage in, I think that we can move towards a system that is on the whole a smaller footprint and better for us all. I'll leave it there, and I saw a few questions in, and I'm really looking forward to seeing them and answering them in a minute.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm just going to take a breath in and applaud virtually with jazz hands. Everybody else can't unmute, of course, because we're in a webinar, but thank you so much for that very rapid but amazing talk through your research and the wider landscape. And I look forward to the discussion we're going to have. Just as a reminder to everybody, these talks are recorded and will be published to our Centre for Food Policy YouTube channel. We have over a decade of Food Thinkers talks on the YouTube channel. So you've had a few minutes to catch your breath, recompose. Thank you so much for this. There are 15 questions, each of which could probably take an hour in the chat themselves. I've been trying to triage as we're going along, and I can see there's now 3 or 4 more questions coming in, so I'll be trying to add them all together. But because we're at the Centre for Food Policy, it's a Food Thinkers, the question I always start off with is, could you give us a headline for policymakers? So on this call, we have local policymakers, we have regional policymakers, we have national and some people from global audiences within the 160 or so people who are here today. So what is the takeaways that they need to be thinking about from a policymaker perspective?
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, I think the key point is things are changing fast. They will continue to change. And in addressing this, both for the impacts that we have from the food system on the environment, on health, for animal welfare, we cannot currently afford it. And the biggest single opportunity that we have for improving resilience, for improving health, and so many other things is this dietary shift. And that doesn't mean cutting out meat completely or animal source foods completely, but it does mean very big reductions. No matter what vision as a policymaker, as a scientist, as a member of the public we have, it implies big reductions in animal source foods. And there's no getting away from that. Ideas around regenerative grazing, things like this, all of them, every single one of them, no matter if you dive into the science or not, is going to require big reductions in animals and the consumption of them in high income nations, in the UK, in Europe.
Some good caveats added at the end there. Thank you very much, Paul. And again, some really powerful points as questions have been coming in, and they're on that. So if I can start off, there have been 4 or 5 questions talking about plant-based diets, exactly as you've highlighted. Could you just clarify, definition, there's sort of 2 or 3 people answered similar versions of this question. How do you define plant-based diet? Does it mean a diet without any animal source food? As the opening question, and people are asking around, is this a shift towards plant-based diets, but how do you then balance accessibility, security, food sovereignty, traditional ways of eating, in terms of traditional cultures versus a new way to eat. But for starters, is a plant-based diet without animals any source of food? Because some people are asking, is dairy an obvious opportunity here compared to animal flesh, as it were?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for the questions. No, by plant-based, I generally mean these sort of big reductions in animal intake. It's not the zero animal diet that I was showing in some of the figures. And that's precisely why we show this range based on the diet that's healthy for the planet, healthy for the people, so that you can see what that range implies in terms of moving towards more plant-based diets. On the points about traditions, well, it sort of depends. I mean, is the tradition to eat so much of these products? I mean, I don't think it is. It's a fairly new thing in the last sort of few decades. And so our traditions really have changed quite a lot. And I think they will continue to change, these traditions. And so I don't really sort of buy this idea that we have to be eating the meat in the same consumption today. I think that's more of a sort of a fear of change argument rather than a tradition argument. I mean, if you're going to go to a tradition argument, you'd think about maybe what your grandparents used to eat, which was so maybe meat once a week or so. Um, so, and I think rather than that sort of, I guess this comes down to this sort of conservative sort of progressive divide as well, of like this interest in exploring new opportunities as well, because we do have traditions of growing sort of more diversity in our plant-based foods as well, and so that would actually be something really enjoyable and exciting to engage in too.
Thank you. And just following on from that, so flipping entirely, another group of questions asking about plant-based were asking about your view for the alternative protein market. So you take the analogy of the electricity markets, and there were different ways that we could go in terms of how these different markets have evolved. And we're somewhere in food, and you're saying there are different trajectories to lowering animal-based protein consumption. Where does alternative proteins fit into this? Is it just a source of more problems? Is it
Yeah. I have to say I'm fairly agnostic about all of this. I mean, I've got my personal views. My personal view is that I would rather that, and what I do, which is shift to more of a whole food plant-based diet,
Mhm.
um, which doesn't necessarily have to involve, old proteins or different versions of that. But I don't think that there's any, there's any sort of, from the environmental perspective, it's not a problem. The problem that you have with it is this concentration of power again, invested interests. And we're going to get onto that.
That was my next question.
Yeah. And you have this same issue with, you've seen the same issue with with the energy system, is that you actually needed the alternative sources to build their own lobbying groups in order to shift the system. In this case, it's not quite as analogous because we could actually just go to whole food plant-based diets, of course. So I think it's a tricky question. I think they're going to have a big role to play, depending on the market segmentation, like depending on the consumers. Some consumers will want this, and I think it's generally going to be a good thing. But again, you've got to keep an eye on that corporate concentration. Some
Mhm.
people won't want it at all, and other people will hang on for dear life on their usual diets.
So I guess thank you for that in terms of just looking at that dietary change and putting it into that bigger perspective. And you started to talk about exactly my next question in terms of given the current political climate globally, how do we bring about these dietary changes needing? But other people in the questions are asking about the current food distribution and the agricultural systems are dominated by very large transnational corporations, and it's the dominant economic system. And
Mhm.
livestock itself is a business model that relies on efficiency and scale. Um, and so, with all of those things combined, how do you get these vested interests to start moving towards this new economic model you're proposing?
Yeah, so I think you've got two
Yeah,
different.
there's two things mushed in there. Sorry, I was trying.
Yeah, no, that's good. So you've got two different avenues there. You've got this niche innovate. So you've got this sort of systems change theory where you have niche innovations which scale, which then outcompete the incumbent industries. So you see that in an energy system, and so you could apply that model to the food system. So you could say, and I think this is what old proteins and the businesses around there are trying to do essentially. You scale through the niche market that you have. You reduce the cost massively through the learning, the technological learning around it. You drive down the prices, and then you outcompete on a product that people really, enjoy and is cheaper. So that's one model. A different model is a more sort of statist in sort of approach, I guess, or a more even a bottom up approach, sort of community agriculture, which is then moving for more towards that plant-based, whole food plant-based vision of the future. I think given that the world that we're in, we'll probably have more of the former rather than the latter. That's not a normative statement about what I want to see. It's what I think probably will happen. So I think probably that if you were to look at this transition and the percentage of contribution of those different models to this transition, that transition of the old proteins probably will be larger than the whole food plant-based part of it.
Even though there's been a much larger run-up of whole food plant-based, but again, as we're highlighting the dominant narratives. So I've got a few questions around specifically UK topics, but I'm going to keep it slightly broad before we go and deep dive into the UK ones, if that's okay. So we have two questions that both mention equity and justice, and kind of just highlighting in terms of either ideas around agroecology and this vision for the food system being possibly at odds with or the ideas of agroecology. But likewise, what about the wider equity and justice aspects of achieving food systems transformation? So that how food sovereignty or these other concepts fits into your so one person's asking mainly about food sovereignty, another person mentioned agroecology in terms of how this actually works. So taking the other end of the spectrum from corporate capture, as it were, how
Yeah.
that fits into these wider transitions from in your viewpoint.
Thank you. And I think this kind of relates to another question I just saw about will these reductions in meat consumption start to happen naturally? I think they probably will. So I think, if you look at agroecology, it's not necessarily at odds with this plant-based shift, because if you look at any sort of the benefits that you're going to get from agroecology, you're going to need much lower stocking densities.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, it comes down to that again. And you're going to need less industrial agriculture. And so, it can be compatible with it. In terms of the food sovereignty, I don't know that there's that much competition with the idea myself. If we get to a stage where the inflation on animal products is getting much higher than the plant-based products, because you're having to pay for the inflation for the plant-based products and the inflation for the animals. So you're having to pay for the heat stress on the animals from the climate impacts and the flooding, etc. And you're having to pay for the stress on the feed crops. Then your animal source products are going to get more and more expensive. So one way or another, that food sovereignty is sort of disappearing out of grasp there. And what you see in the past, and you see these sorts of situations, is then people trying to produce as much from the land that they can. And I think we underestimate how much we can grow on pasture lands, and we can innovate with different types of crops. So in
Mm-hmm.
the Netherlands, for example, they're looking at temperate soy. Now, it doesn't have to be temperate soy. In the UK, we're very good at growing beans and peas, and we just do it at such a small scale at the moment. And we can do it on pasture too, but on a much lower, it'll be a lower yield, of course. But because we've saved so much land upstream, and also there's croplands. I mean, ultimately, we won't need to do this because we'll save so much of the cropland anyway in this highly productive land that we'd be able to replace it with legumes, for example, and they're the big winners here.
No, I think everyone at the Centre for Food Policy is a fan of beans and legumes in one form or another. I'm sure many people on today's call as well. So thank you for highlighting that, if I can summarize, compatibility with some of these different things. So yeah, thank you. So moving on, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball here at this stage. So Duncan Williamson's asking, what about blue foods? If we're talking food systems, we need to include them, but your slides really don't mention blue foods much at all.
Yeah, I think my own sense on this, I haven't focused as much on blue foods, and I know that there is some excitement about it. My own feelings is less that excitement. We have many issues with the sustainability of fish stocks, for example. I think the one area that I think is interesting is potentially shellfish. And we can potentially explore all that more. But if we look at fish, for example, there doesn't seem to be many options there for sustainability.
No, again, these are live issues. Thank you. In terms of just that tension. Sorry, I'm rapidly trying to get through as many questions as we can. And thank you, people, for continually to putting them into the chat. It's making my job much more fun. There's a good block of questions now about specific policies. And so one of the people highlights that you mentioned a good study on interventions to shift towards a plant-based diet, and that was from the citizens' perspective. Are there any other policies that you could highlight, or
Oh,
things
yeah.
that you could highlight for either the producer or the consumer or the wider aspect that help in this manner? There's a couple of other ones in terms of questions, but I'll start with that one if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, the most interesting work on this so far in real world reports is the Danish plant-based action plan. And there, the Danish government, along with many of the stakeholders in Denmark, have looked at how you address the entire supply chain and interventions across it. So it's not just on demand, it's not just on supply, it's all the way through. And that's really interesting. I think a really big one is public procurement. What we've seen across the world at the moment is that more and more diets and nationally recommended diets are coming out more and more plant-based. So Germany recently suggested that about 75% of the diet should come from plants at least. Spain moved more towards plant-based diets. Canada has a lot of countries have moved. I mean, we did a study back in 2017, and the movement has been quite fast on that. And so then the question is, if you're procuring food for your national institutions, shouldn't it be more like those nationally recommended diets? And that offers a huge market there for which different products can scale. And it doesn't have to be the old proteins, it can be the diverse plant-based foods that we talked about earlier.
Brilliant. And you just started to talk there. So the next question I was going to say is, are there any other sorts of subsidy or tax that you think would enable a shift towards environment, health, livestock-friendly food systems? So would this be, I can throw a couple at you, but do you have any kind of best case models or anything else besides the Danish example that you gave?
Yeah, I think the tax situation and the subsidy situation is always the hardest one. They are always the things that are going to change the slowest, but they have the biggest impact often. And you see that in the fossil industry, you see that in the food industry. And so when you do look at carbon taxes, for example, or you look at environmental taxes in general, what you see from the scientific literature is that you need a whole bunch of other policies to come in. There's a pathway towards that tax. It's the last thing that happens. But one study found, for example, that in many countries you needed on average about 10 other policies related to public procurement, efficiencies, other environmental standards until they got to that tax point. So that's where you need to, you eventually get to, and then you get your big lever. The Danish obviously are bringing in their methane tax, for example. It's not coming in for quite some years. It's the first of a kind. It's still sort of some way off, but it offers a sort of an opportunity. The other area which I think is quite interesting is from that old protein perspective. You have some countries that import quite a lot of food and quite a lot of meat and would rather stop doing that. And those countries are developing their own sort of alt protein industries in order to improve food sovereignty. By doing that, they will reduce, or food self-sufficiency, I say, not food sovereignty, but by doing that, they will reduce the prices of that for everyone. And I think there's another niche there in terms of, and what they're thinking about doing is putting up tariffs on imported meat, for example. And
So it's funny that you mentioned that. So the next of these policy questions was exactly on an import ban.
yeah,
And just again, if we're in our brave new world of 18 days into a Trump presidency, we are talking about tariffs in a way we never have before.
yeah.
Well, in a way we haven't since the 1960s, shall we say? But just highlighting that one of the people was asking, if we're reducing animal agriculture to very low levels in the UK, what is proposed in regard to imports to make sure we are supporting a domestic production? Would we be having to ban imports of meat? Otherwise, we're encouraging animal agriculture in other countries that could outcompete and be producing. We're offshoring. So I guess again, is there anything else in terms of both UK basis for that, and wider, and any other reflections?
Yeah, I think the answer to that then just, it has to somehow come down to that price point that you're seeing in the supermarket. And that can be addressed by carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So this is a very sort of European sort of long acronym, but this is essentially tariffs, yeah, on products. And what that does is it doesn't have to be the argument that you're just putting tariffs on um, countries that are, to sort of hide your markets away. It can be an argument that, we have these standards here and we want you to meet them. And that's all that is that you're playing on the same playing level. And that's what the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU does for steel, for concrete, I think concrete and a couple of other products, which they're going to expand out. Sorry, the lights keep going on and off here. So I'm going into darkness and I'm coming into light.
Don't worry, it's why I'm moving around so much here as well. It's all sensor-driven lights
Yeah.
here at the Centre for Food Policy. Um, it's all illuminating, shall we say. With that in mind, so I'm noticing time is flying, and I'm having a lot of fun in asking these questions. There's many, many more coming up in the chat. You mentioned the Dublin Declaration.
Mhm.
And one of the questions that was received in the chat by an anonymous attendee asks, thank you for the presentation. How best to tackle the immense lobby groups, research organizations that seek to discredit, disseminate, or spread and promote doubt? Um, so those may be connected to that question or other things that you've raised in this. Do you want to just expand on any of your advice or talk more through, I guess, the political economy or the reasons this is happening?
Yeah, thanks so much, Christian. I think to my mind, the food system is going through that same thing that the energy transition had about 10 years ago, and it's still going on to some extent. It will continue on, the misinformation, the denial, the delay. And I think the best ways for academics and sort of policymakers to engage with this is to learn from the communication specialists. And so listen to those specialists and what they're saying. There's people like George Marshall, who works on how to talk about climate change. There's groups like Changing Market Foundation that look at, how do you make communications around this, or the Strategic Communications Council. And what they typically say over and over again is that you have to repeat yourself. And as scientists, we don't like doing that. And as policymakers, we don't really like doing that either. They don't like doing that either. And we have to keep in mind that the first time that we're absolutely sick of saying something is also the first time that somebody else is hearing it. And we have to get over that. And so we have to find these really nice, quick, communication-friendly ways of saying things and repeat things over and over again. That's on the communication side. And in terms of the organization side, I think it's working with groups that are well aware of some of the issues and then helping them to address the science. Sometimes those groups will get it wrong and you have to correct them. They may go too far and you have to say, no, look, that's not okay. There's no science that stands that up, but there is science that says this, and this is what it says. So as scientists, it's having that influence through those groups rather than trying to do it individually.
Thank you. That's some good advice, and I guess that highlights all of us to actually reach out and identify those practitioners in our area who are actually doing the best forms of science communication and signal boosting them.
And also vice versa, that last slide that I showed, I think, people who are in the policy space or in the NGO space maybe underestimate how willing scientists would be to get involved to help. And if there's anything that comes from the talk, hopefully that's really important, that there's this latent desire to be useful. The scientists want to be useful. It's not just, publishing papers for paper's sake,
No.
the papers analyze something and they want to help.
So two more questions I think we've got time for before we close off. These are slightly UK-centric questions, but again have relevance to wider. So one of them is on the current land use framework. So this is just highlighting that a few days ago, weeks, the land use consultation documents came out, and it was saying 9% moving from food production to environmental and climate, and they have a 2050 time horizon for that. And again, there's delays in implementation. There's lots of missed targets in land use work. So what has your modeling shown in this area, slash where's the wider literature looking at saying, is 9% enough? Should it be much more ambitious? Are you going to be putting in a proposal to the committee? Get any sneak peeks for now?
It's not enough, but it's a reasonable start. Um, the it's not enough because we are starting from a very poor position in the UK, as one of the most, nature degraded countries. And so simply from a biodiversity sort of nature perspective, it has to be more. And it has to be more for our own sort of targets as well, biodiversity targets. If you look at the land use framework as well, they still inherit the old only start recovering nature by 2042, I think it was.
Hmm.
And that's not early enough. That's not soon enough. And we can do much better than that. We can do it by 2030, where we start actually recovering rather than just halting biodiversity loss. And it's a very good biodiversity perspective, but of course that will help for climate as well. And resilience. And I think this keeps coming back to this thing about resilience. As these shocks start happening, we have to be communicating, actually, the option here is the option that's really good for all of us, is in addressing this system, is making this system smaller so that we have more headroom.
And just leading on to that, so a couple of questions, and this wasn't on the list, but just to go into that, was highlighting, is regenerative within this pathway, or is regenerative such a mix of terms right now that it can't be part of the discussion?
Yeah, and unfortunately, my own view on this is that regenerative has become just another word that is a delay rather than an action word. So it's rather a word about where you want to end up rather than policies. And the problem with these words is that they can be used to delay action, as I say. So you can call anything regenerative under these sorts of rubrics that some of the, to some extent, that's corporate capture of the word. It reminds me of a paper that I once reviewed, and they basically looked at the development of words like sustainable development, sustainable growth, circular economy over time. And what they found was in these same reports that they saw as sustainable growth reduced, circular economy increased. And then they looked at the same reports, these annual reports, and they basically did a search find on them. And then what they found was that actually they were just using circular economy in the same way that they used sustainable growth. And it allowed the industry, it allowed everybody to be excited about this new thing, but actually nothing had
Mm.
changed. And I think that's the sort of same thing as agroecology. So you go from agroecology and now sort of regenerative is now coming into real sort of fashion. And then probably when that word has become sort of so diluted, it will move on to another word. That's my own opinion on that. I don't know whether that's actually going to happen, but my concern is it will be used as just a greenwashing word that you slap on things.
No, thank you. And again, it's a topic that students of ours are doing dissertations on at the moment, but there were questions in the chat. Um, we will try and ask Paul afterwards. So some people in the chat are asking for, could Paul tell us again the name of that paper? We're not going to put you under that pressure now, but we'll try and on the Food Thinkers YouTube, ask you to see if we can get any of the papers that you've referenced, and we'll put DOIs under there or something like that. Just because I can't remember half the things I reference off the top of my head in a Q&A, so I'm sure that would be a pretty tricky thing to do. I feel that's we've given you an onslaught for 25 minutes or so of non-stop questions. Is there anything else you want to highlight or some things I've not missed that you can see from the chat?
Could I just add one more? Sorry, Christian, I've
Of
already
course, not
done
at all,
a
not
couple
at
already,
all.
but I just saw ultra processed, and I think we just have to address this. So there's this concern that the old proteins, are ultra processed in terms of that they're going to have these poor health outcomes, and that's not what the research is showing at the moment. So if you control your ultra processed foods for the ones that are heavy in meat or heavy in sugar, salt, and fats, you see negative health outcomes. If you see plant-based ultra-processed foods on the current classification, you see positive health outcomes. And so we have to be really careful with this ultra-processed food. I totally agree that ultra-processed food has allowed a certain corporate and food environment, and that is a bad thing. But we have to be nuanced about this and say, well, actually, these plant-based options, they're not the damaging UPFs that people are talking about when they talk about ultra processed foods, and being very specific about that, because that is another area where the vested interests are saying, well, thank you very much for this one. We can push this, all the way to the bank. And partly the reason of that is because if you look at the plant-based ultra processed foods, on the whole, not all the time, but on the whole, they have more vegetable content, they have higher fiber, they have lower fats, lower salts, lower sugars, not in all over, always, but in
Hmm.
general. So I just want to really sort of
No, it is
cover
a
that
very
point.
hot and contentious issue. We've had previous food thinkers looking at measurement of ultra processed foods and all of the different areas. So again, we could spend another hour talking about that, as it were. But no, thank you for those points. I think the question itself was saying just in terms of the overall environmental footprint and the corporate capture of these sorts of things. And so it was somebody as a farmer highlighting that as an anxiety. So I think you've responded to that fully. Right. I think that's probably all as many questions as we can get through in terms of just the numbers because of them. Thank you so much, Paul, for that bombardment of questions for 20 or so minutes. Thank you for your presentation today. Again, we'll just give you a round of virtual applause. It will be lovely to see all of you here for Kerry Bradshaw in a couple of weeks' time for the March Food Thinkers, and hopefully please also register and see you in person for the Food Policy Symposium on the 15th of May. So thank you, everybody saying into the chat, thank you. So thank you very, very much, Paul. And I look forward to seeing you in person at the LEAP Oxford conference in
Thanks very much.
May as well.
That's
So
fantastic. Cheers.
see you and thank you so much.
Thanks.